start. Thanks. We want to be sure that we have as much time as possible with our guest speaker and have the opportunity to get your questions asked. Hang on just a second here. Just quickly, because I know lots of times after our meetings, people are anxious to get on with their Saturdays. I just want to remind you that our next group meeting will be March the 14th, and it will be in Memphis. And there will be a follow-up presentation to this. We have folks from Papa Yelps who are going to come at 11:30 instead of 10:15, because that's when we can book the facility. And they will talk about immigration issues in rural communities. So it'll be a really nice partner with what Contest has to share this morning. So please mark your calendar and post it with them. Thank you for that. I also just really quickly have been asked to announce that we have new copies of The 7 Women Who Never Gave Up to the Women that helped found the League of Women Voters. And if you are interested, there are copies back there. And you'd like to have a donation to $600, but they are on the sacred path. So without further ado, I want to introduce our guest. Hans Meyer is the founder of the Meyer Law Office for Federal Corporations. His practice specializes in immigration law and removal defense, criminal defense, and post-conviction relief, the immigration consequences of crimes, and the civil rights of immigrants. Hans advocates for the statutory and constitutional rights of immigrants before various immigration agencies, state and federal courts, often against governmental and institutional abuses of power. He is a former trial attorney with the Colorado State Public Defender's Office, where he became an expert in the field of what's called cremation, which is a body of law within immigration law that deals with criminal offenses and their effects on someone's immigration status. He has developed a statewide immigration advisement system for indigent, non-citizen defendants. He has also served as the former director of public policy for the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, where he focused on local, state, and national immigration policy. He is a nationally recognized expert, frequently lecturing and appearing in the press on issues related to immigration law and the criminal justice system. And he's received a number of very prestigious awards, including recognition for his outstanding work in immigration law. Hans grew up in Aurora, Colorado, and is a 2006 graduate of the evening program at the University of Denver School College of Law. Prior to his career as an attorney, he was a forest firefighter, a construction worker, and an outward bound instructor. And he also spent several years living, working, and traveling in Latin America, focusing primarily on human rights issues in Guatemala and Chiapas, Mexico. So I'm very pleased that you're here with us today, Hans, and I'm turning forward to you.
Thank you, Karen, for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, can you all hear?
Yes.
All right, great. I can't really see the audience, so I don't know how many folks we got, but good morning, everybody. Hope you're all doing good down in Southwest Colorado. It's a nice, sunny, cold day here in the Front Range. I'm originally from Aurora and have been bopping around Colorado for about 5 decades. So it's good to be able to present with y'all and just kind of be in a conversation here about immigration stuff. So I put together a little bit of a PowerPoint that I might share. Sorry, I've got a cat helping me here.
My cat is doing
that I'm going to go ahead and share for a little bit. And I thought what we could do is I'll go through a couple of slides and kind of pause, and then maybe we can talk through stuff and try to do questions and answers. I know a lot of people intersect with immigration and with different levels of experience. Some people don't really work in this area, which makes sense. And so I'm trying to figure out a good baseline for us to have a productive conversation. So let me just try to jump straight in here and go for it real quick. Can folks see my PowerPoint now?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Okay. Alrighty, let's go ahead and jump in. What Karen and I talked about is maybe talking a little bit about some aspects of immigration law, pathways, costs, and policy shifts in 2026. And we could, with just those three small subject matters, no, we could, sorry, my cat's eating my power cord. Give me just a second. No.
Reality.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Um, with just these three subjects, we could spend 6 hours. So we're going to try to touch on some stuff, but we'll leave some things on the table that we're not even able to cover. But let's get kind of rolling with things and maybe start off and just talk about different types of immigration status, right? Obviously, first and foremost, there's U.S. citizens, and those folks are no longer immigrants because they're citizens. And in the law, once you're a citizen, immigration law no longer applies to you. Then there's a big group of people known as green card holders, right? Green card is not the legal term. We call it a lawful permanent resident, but it's the same thing. It means a person has applied for and obtained lawful status in the country, and that gives them the opportunity and the right to work in the US. They pay into the tax base, they're eligible for most sort of privileges related to citizenship, with the exception of not being able to vote, not being able to serve on a jury, and some other exceptions related to the privileges of citizenship. There's another group of people called basically lawful non-immigrants, and that's basically folks here on visas, right, or some sort of temporary status, and that can include people on tourist visas. It can include people working in the tech industry. It could include people working in like the agricultural space as like a temporary worker. All sorts of different versions of that. Students sometimes at universities, and then you've got groups of people that are known as refugees and asylees. Those are people who either have already been approved by refugees are people who have been approved by the United Nations to qualify as refugees. And then countries accept certain populations of them in. So they've sort of been pre-approved through immigration law. Asylees are people who come to the US, usually to a border or fly into the country and then apply for asylum here who have no status at all. So similar but different in how they intersect. The basis, though, for them seeking protection has to do with fear of persecution. Then there's other types of status, things like temporary protected status, or something we call DACA. And some people probably know about DACA. DACA is a program that provides temporary protections to people who came to the US as children, who grew up here, attended school and graduated from high school, and are usually have been tied into the community for maybe 20 to 30 years. And then we have a population of people who are undocumented or who are out of status. That might include somebody who came with a visa and that visa expired, or it might be somebody who just came into the country without permission and has lived here and worked here for, any time between a day and 40 years, right? Depending on their personal circumstances. So that's kind of like the general types of immigration status. Again, when we get into types of status, there's probably like 30 different types of visas, but those are the sort of general categories of people. I wanted to touch maybe a little bit on the structure in immigration law, and the structure in immigration, or what we call the Department of Homeland Security. And I'll cover one or two more slides and then we can maybe do some questions. But the Department of Homeland Security is a really big agency. It's the biggest law enforcement agency in the world, if I'm not mistaken, but definitely in the United States. It's the most well funded. There's three sections of this that relate to the immigration space. The one on the far left-hand side is called the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. That's the agency that decides people's applications. Someone's applying for a green card. Somebody's applying for a work permit. Somebody's applying for citizenship. U.S. citizenship, USCIS, that's what we call it. They're the agency that decides those things. Second group is Customs and Border Protection. That's pretty obvious. Those are the folks who work at the border, right? Generally speaking, we've seen in the Trump administration, Customs and Border Protection being in Minneapolis, in Portland, in other cities, but their traditional role has been to sort of enforce the border. And then the third organization is ICE, which generally tends to be internal enforcement inside the US, which is the agency that goes around and looks for people who violated immigration law to apprehend them and put them into deportation, or what we call in the law removal proceedings. Let me go through this real fast here. Just a sort of summary, a little bit more of a drill down on USCIS. They're the organization that can adjudicate and give benefits. So green card applications, citizenship applications, applications for DACA and temporary protected status, and other visas. And we'll pause here for just a second, and we can discuss maybe a little bit pathways to status. But before we do, maybe what I'll do is kind of pop out of the window real quick, and then see if I can answer any questions if anybody has any so far.
If you have a question, if you just want to project loudly so that Hans can hear you. Anybody? No questions?
Great, let's keep going.
Which
Oh.
one of those agencies is only allowed to operate within 100 miles of the border?
Did you hear that, Hans?
I didn't hear a word of it.
Okay, she wants to know which one of the agencies is only allowed to operate within 100 miles of the border.
Oh, okay, great question. Sorry, I couldn't hear you. That's generally speaking Customs and Border Protection. Now, you've obviously seen that they're operating within the inside of the U.S., and that's because they've been redeployed by the Trump administration for purposes of interior immigration enforcement. But Customs and Border Protection generally works along the border.
Also, that agency, does it guard the border from Canada?
Yes. Yeah, so the question was, does that agency guard the border with Canada as well? Yes. Obviously, there's a lot less agents on the northern border than there are on the southern border.
I think we can go on.
Great. Let me jump back in here to the first thing. And this is one thing I wanted to sort of talk about is people talk about things like amnesty, right? Like there's an amnesty. But I think it's important to be clear legally, there's no amnesty. There hasn't been an amnesty for 38 years. There's been no immigration reform in law that allows people a new way to apply for status. So that term gets thrown around a lot as a way to try to classify certain things as something that they're not. So we can have a debate about what certain policies are, like temporary protected status, but they're not amnesties, right? And amnesty is really just kind of a broad term to describe a pathway that Reagan passed in the 1980s. It's important to remember that this was passed by a Republican president, and I believe either a divided chamber or Republican-controlled chambers into law. And this allowed undocumented folks who qualified for with certain requirements or certain criteria to apply for status, but they had to earn the application for status, and there was various things they had to demonstrate and prove in order to obtain the green card. It's not an amnesty. An amnesty is like, we're just going to forget everything and you're good. This was an earned pathway. And that's important because people had to file taxes. They had to demonstrate physical presence. They had to demonstrate they didn't have certain criminal history. But that last set of applications was decided, I believe, December 1st, 1990. So that's 35 years ago. So the result is that there's just no easy way to fix your papers, right? Like a lot of people are like, I don't understand why you didn't just fix his papers. Well, I can tell you why, as a lawyer who's done this for 20 years. There isn't a way to do that for most people. That's why they haven't. If I told you, why can't you just why can't you just go to the I know how to dunk a basketball training camp? Most of you would probably say, I won't be able to dunk a basketball because I just can't do it, right? And there's just differences between what is legally available versus what comes out of people's mouths when they talk about an issue they don't know anything about. So I think when people talk about how they should just fix their papers or go get a green card, what they don't understand is that the pathways to do so are very limited, which has maybe in some ways gotten us into a little bit of the situation we're in terms of dealing with an immigration policy that doesn't really reflect where we're at as a country or the economic needs of our communities. Let's see here. Let me move us forward. All right, let me see. Controls. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, so let's talk about asylum. What is asylum? Asylum came about because after the Holocaust, countries came together and formed the United Nations and basically said, we had a huge collective failure as a world to protect people from persecution and death during World War II. That's basically how asylum law came about. And so in 1951, there was a UN convention, then there was a follow-up protocol in 1967, and then countries adopted that convention and protocol, and the US did so in 1980, that defines what is a refugee, what is a person who qualifies for asylum. And what that is a person who has to demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution on account of one of 5 categories: race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. And this is where a lot of the rhetoric gets lost, is that asylum cases are actually incredibly difficult to win because to qualify is very, very narrow. So let me give you a couple of examples of cases that do not qualify for asylum. War. War doesn't qualify you for asylum. War is just war. Death is just death. Suffering is just suffering. If you're not being persecuted based on your race or your political opinion, there's just a war and people are being killed, that's not asylum. Another example would be, economic desperation or a collapsing nation, right? I mean, Venezuela, that might be an example. There's other examples too. That doesn't qualify anybody for asylum. A failed state does not an asylum application make. And so realistically, the ability prior to Trump to qualify for asylum was already fairly difficult. It's not an easy application. And it's not an easy pathway to status. It's hard because a lot of times you have to demonstrate not just the persecution, but the persecution is done against you because of your religion or because of the fact maybe you're a union member or a journalist, right, in a foreign country. But demonstrating that and proving that can be quite difficult. So there are pathways through there, but they are very difficult. Now, in a post-Trump world, where the Trump administration has come in and, for better or worse, has sort of engaged in a full-on assault on the concept of asylum, there's a lot of processes that have become a lot more difficult and a lot more restrictive. And so realistically, for a lot of people, asylum is a very, very difficult case to win. So it's important to understand that it is an opportunity to obtain status, but it's not a good one. It's very difficult. I'll give you one last sort of example is that oftentimes the politics of asylum really depend on U.S. foreign policy. So, for example, during the Cold War, the U.S. granted asylum to people from the Soviet Union based on political persecution, which was legitimate. I think at a rate of like 40 to 50%. This is like in the late 80s, right? Before the fall of the Berlin Wall. At the same time, there was political persecution in El Salvador where, US funded death squads were going around and eradicating entire populations of people based on their perceived political membership. And those asylum rates were granted at 2%. So the difference between those two is pretty significant. And that's in many ways reflective of the US foreign policy interests, which the US was aligned against the Soviet Union, right? And was training and supporting the El Salvadoran military and paramilitary in the 1980s. So just an explanation for why you're going to see different results based on different countries and different political interests by the government. That is not something new in the Trump administration. That's been around forever. Let's talk about this. I want to take questions on this one because I think this is a really important thing to get through. Let me try to get through these 2 or 3 slides and then we can do some question and answers. And this kind of goes back to this concept of go to the green card store and get your green card. Don't be such a lazy bum, right? So let's talk about how do you apply and get status in immigration law through family relationships. There are basically 3 buckets of pathways to status or status in immigration law in general. One of them is this persecution-based type of application, asylum, and other types of protection. One is business-related pathways, investor visas, high-tech visas, and other things. We're not really going to touch that much. The third one is family. And so immigration law is structured in some ways around family relationships. So that allows people who are US citizens to apply for their spouses and their children who are under 21 and their parents. So if I'm a US citizen, I meet someone from another country, I can apply for them. Or if somebody's here in the country and I meet them, I can apply for them. So let's talk about a little bit about what this looks like. This is, excuse me. These are family-based applications for people in the United States who may not have status, but who came here with a visa. So let me give you an example. I come in with a visa when I'm 3 years old, and for whatever reason, my parents stay, and I grow up here. Then I'm 30 years old and I get married to somebody who's a US citizen. That person has a right to apply for me. There's a lot of complicated specifics that we'll skip, but that process for me is the fastest process in immigration law. Would probably take 1 to 2 years and cost $3,000 in application fees and reasonably probably $5,000 to $10,000 in attorney fees, right? Depends on the person, depends on the issues, depends on the complexity, but that's just kind of a general benchmark. That group of people is called immediate relatives, spouses, parents, kids of US citizens. Then there's a group of family relationships like spouses and kids of someone who has a green card, or a person who's an adult child of a United States citizen. And that's a whole different bucket. That's called preference relatives. And basically there's a limited number of visas for those people. And those lines can take anywhere from 2 to 25 years. So I'll give you an example. Let's say my parents came to the US from Germany with tourist visas and I was 3 years old, right? When I came with them. And then we all overstayed our visas and we built a life here and whatever. I thought I was growing up as a citizen, but I'm not. Then my parents have another kid here in the US. Well, that my sibling can apply for me to become a resident, but that line can take up to 25 years. So if a brother or sister to apply for somebody can take, 10, 20 years longer than an immediate relative application can take. So it gets a little confusing because if I came in and grew up here and then married a resident, I might need to wait 3 to 5 to 7 years to be able to get my green card. And oftentimes to get that green card in that application process, I have to leave the country and process through my home country. So logistically, it just becomes much more difficult. And for many applications, they can take up to 2 decades or more. Let me talk about this slide too. And this is like family-based applications. Let's do this as these are hypos. So Example one, I come to the US as a child with a tourist visa. I stay with my family. I grow up. I later marry a US citizen a quarter of a century later, and we have 2 kids. I apply for green card status. That's probably the best scenario. That would probably take me 1 to 2 years. I could do so here in the country. There's a lot of vetting, background checks, interviews, and scrutiny. But I probably have a decent chance of obtaining that green card in 1 to 2 years. Downside is I spent 25 years without status. So, I didn't have any status for 25 years. Scenario number two, I marry a resident and I have the same facts, but I marry a person with a green card instead of a person who's a citizen. That process is more likely to take 2 to 5 years, probably cost a significant amount more, and there's a decent chance I may have to go apply through the consulate in my home country to get my green card. So I have to leave the country and leave my 2 kids and my wife to go apply for my status outside of the country. But still a pathway that probably makes some sense. Example three is the same scenario, except I came in, I grew up here. Maybe I'm married to somebody, or maybe I'm not, and I have 2 US citizen kids, ages 5 and 7 years old. So I've been here 25 years and I have 2 US citizen kids. I have no pathway to status. That's not going to happen. What might happen is 14 years from now, when my oldest child is 21 years old, they can apply for me. That would mean that I would have been in the country 39 years without status, waiting for the ability for my child to be old enough to apply for me. So it's just an example of, a lot of times people talk about this term anchor baby and all this other stuff and chain migration. That's not accurate either, but it's a nice talking point to just slam people, but it's not actually accurate, right? The lines for most people in that type of process, and having a kid in here doesn't necessarily provide you with any pathway to status that happens in anything less than 2 decades in the best case scenario. So that's an important piece, I think, to keep in mind when people are talking about their emotional feelings around immigration law, rather than maybe talking about the facts of how the actual law works. Example 4 will lead us into a new hypothetical. Let's say I came to the country with my parents when I was 5, but we just came across the border. We didn't have a visa, and my dad came to work in the fields, and he came down to Cortez, right? We built a life, and we've lived in Cortez for 25 years, and we own a home, and I got 2 kids, and they go to school there. And we'll talk about what that looks like. And let's say I then settle down and I'm married to somebody and I want to look at applying for my papers. That process is very, very, very different. And this is what happens to most undocumented folks. There's still a process, but the process for me is a lot longer. So the first step is my wife or spouse would have to file a petition that takes about 1 to 2 years to get approved. Then after that, I have to apply for a pardon for just having been here without status. That takes another 2 to 5 years to get decided. Let's assume it gets approved. Then we have to go through a third step, which is going through this visa center processing, and then me leaving the country to go to an interview at the consulate. That takes another 1 to 2 years. So even though I'm married to a US citizen, my process can take 6 to 7 years because I came without a visa, compared to had I came in with a visa and then overstayed, which would be 1 to 2 years here in the country. So the difference is another 4 to 5 to 6 years, and an easily doubling of the price to apply. It also creates some logistics issues because I'm going to have to leave my job. I'm going to have to go back to my home country. I'm not going to be able to be with my kids and my spouse while I do some of this application process in step 3. So logistically, it just becomes a little more complicated. Why don't I pause there for a second and we can maybe take some questions or some thoughts or some comments that people have.
Okay, Hans, there was a question in the chat. Do you have to have a lawyer?
Well, it's a tough question to ask a lawyer, isn't it? Of course I'm going to say yes. I I think the reality is the legal immigration system is really complicated. It's not made to be very user friendly. It's even confusing for me and other immigration lawyers. And there's a lot of ways where innocent like oversights or mistakes or errors on applications can have really profound consequences. So my advice is always, especially in this time frame in this political environment, it'd be really good to have an attorney to help you navigate this process because I'd probably say a third of the people who come to me have their applications destroyed because they do them themselves or because they hire a notario or somebody that's called a notary that files paperwork that people aren't eligible for or that isn't done correctly and they end up getting denied. And then they have to come back to me and I got to try to fix it. And the example that I use is like, anybody who works in the trades, right? If you are an electrician or you do, carpentry and you have to go into a house or a build and tear out the old work that isn't done up to code and then redo it all, it's twice as much work, right? And it becomes, a lot harder. It's like that in the immigration space too. So the long answer to the short question is I generally suggest that you're not buying a car, you're doing something that impacts your entire life. So do it right, which means you should probably hire someone to help you navigate it. Then the question becomes, can you find someone that you can trust? That's a different conversation.
Well, how do you go about finding somebody you can trust?
Well, there's always the gut, right? That's probably a good start, right? Because if you feel like someone's telling you something that sounds too pretty, they probably are. But I think there's a 3-step process. Number one, I think you want to try to find somebody who almost exclusively practices immigration law. Someone does family law and civil and probate and immigration, they're probably not the right fit because immigration law is super complicated and it's hard enough just to practice that one area and stay up to date on things. Number two, you want to check to make sure they have a bar license in the state of Colorado or in some state. Number three, you want to make sure they don't have any disciplinary history. So you can look all this up online, usually. And number four, it might be nice to find out whether or not other people have had positive experiences with the attorney, right? And one thing I always tell people is law is uncertain. So, you can have people who lose cases, but the lawyer does an exceptionally good job. Sometimes the law is just unfair, right? So it's not necessarily whether or not something good happens in one person's case. It's whether or not the attorney has experience in that area, focuses on that area, is barred, insured, doesn't have disciplinary complaints against them, hasn't had anything bad happen. And then you've got maybe like both word of mouth and experiences from other people who've worked with that person.
I have a question about what you were talking about with asylum seekers, that war is not a criteria for asylum seeking. I'm interested in those situations in which there's genocide or there actually is religious persecution and there is a war situation. And I'm thinking like in Myanmar, where the Rohingyas, as a collective bloc are persecuted, would they then be eligible?
You cut out there just a little bit at the end, but yeah, I think I can answer your question. So you have a good example. So while I say that war doesn't make you eligible for asylum, there's still situations in which you could qualify for refugee status or asylum status in the context of a war. In the example you're using, you're talking about like an ethnic group, the Rohingya in Myanmar that have been targeted functionally for extermination by the government, right? So there is a war, but there's also persecution based on the fact that
Hans, can you start that again? We apparently our connection's weak, and so
no problem.
We only heard part of that. Turn the
Sure.
video off.
Yeah, it's a great question. Sometimes you can qualify for persecution even though there's a war, but you have to fit it in the context of asylum. The example you're using is talking about the Rohingya. ethnic group, which the Myanmar government has basically targeted for extinction. You know, they're basically trying to exterminate that group. And so that would be a way that you would show I'm being persecuted because I'm Rohingya. There's a war too, but I'm Rohingya. So if you were like, let's say you were a Christian in a Muslim country and the Muslim government said, we're going to go around and execute every Christian, like, or vice versa, you're in a Christian nation and they're going to go around and execute every Muslim. You would have an argument that my persecution is based on my religion, and they know that I'm Muslim or they know that I'm Christian for whatever reason, right? You know, I practice, I'm open with my faith, whatever that might be. So that is still doable. And one other thing to note about your example about Myanmar is that oftentimes fits more in the refugee column because a lot of people who are in the United States from Myanmar were admitted as refugees. So the United Nations already screened and approved them as refugees internationally. And then countries from around the world have said, well, we'll accept 2,000 of those refugees. We'll accept 1,500. We'll accept 5,000. We'll accept 20. And so many people who are dealing with Burma or Myanmar related persecution cases are already admitted to the country with status. They're refugees. So they've already come in with status. They don't have to apply for it.
Now, can that status then lead to citizenship? Or do they have a leg up?
Yes, absolutely. Great question. If you're admitted as a refugee, yes, after you've been here for a year, you're allowed to apply for your green card.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So I know there's talk about quotas that are sent. I'm glad you drew the distinction between asylum seekers and refugees because that was getting confused in my mind. Who actually sets those quotas? Is that within DHS? Is that Congress? Is that like what branch?
Yeah, I think it's within DHS. It's within the executive who can decide how many refugees to admit, which is why Trump has said we don't want to admit refugees, right, anymore. They might be refugees internationally, but we're just not going to take any of them. Or we'll take, you know, white farmers from South Africa or whatever the version is that Trump has decided he wants to admit, right? So, and that's a very political issue, right? There's going to be different levels of deciding to accept refugees depending on administrations.
Example, Nigeria, Christians, Trump attacking Nigeria, and he could probably allow people come right into the country as asylum.
Well, again, let's draw a distinction. There are refugees and then there are asylees. Refugees are screened by the United Nations. Many of them sit in refugee camps for a decade. They're screened, they live in squalor, they go to the bathroom in pails and dump it into latrines. Like that is the experience that a lot of people have while they're waiting for the United Nations to screen them for refugee status. And if and when they're approved, then they just wait until countries decide whether we'll take somebody and how many people we'll accept. Then there are people who are asylees, right? And those folks come to the US and apply for asylum, right? And then they basically have to argue that they qualify for asylum based on qualifying as a fear of persecution based on one of those 5 categories.
Other questions? You guys are such a quiet group today.
Hans, I have a question. If you obtain asylee status and your country changes governments so that you wouldn't be persecuted anymore, do they take that away like they do TPS?
That's a really great question. Historically speaking, no, because usually when the government, USCIS, or an immigration court decides to grant you asylum, it's based on the conditions at that moment. And usually once you're granted asylum a year later, you're eligible for a green card. So most people apply for and get a green card. And once you have a green card, there's not really like a legitimate basis to go back and take it away from you, right? They have to have a legally justifiable ground to do so. So once you have a green card, you're much more protected. And the basis to take away somebody's green card usually has to be criminal activity or like fraud or misrepresentation in the application process itself. And if a person didn't commit fraud or misrepresentation and they were protected, and then the Berlin Wall falls, and then everybody says now there's no longer communism, we should be able to send you back to East Germany, or we should be able to send you back to Belarus or whatever. If a person has been a green card holder, they're usually sort of protected from being exposed to that. Before that, things can be really, really dicey. Yeah. I think there's a question or a comment in the chat. Let me just address that. When there is a quota for refugees, how are they prioritized for admission? Is it based on first come, first serve, or there is a lottery? So when there is a quota for refugees, how are they prioritized for admission? Is there first in, first out, or a lottery? And I'll just be honest, I don't know. I don't actually know how they pick people from a pool after they've been decided or after they've been granted refugee status internationally. It's an opaque process that I'm not aware of. Other questions about some of the family-based immigration, amnesty, asylum?
What's the status of the Dreamers at this point?
Oh, great question. Let me go back to our slides and maybe use that as a way to keep moving with some stuff, because there's some additional things that I thought we could talk about here. Let's go to this slide.
And Hans, could you tell us what LPR stands for? Maybe I missed that.
Yeah, absolutely. It stands for a green card. The legal term is lawful permanent resident.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what the law terms it, but we call it just in the world a green card. And let's kind of talk about the DACA thing. But before we get through that, let's kind of just go to like a very simple slide, which is, this kind of goes back to the idea. Well, like, why don't you just apply for your green card through work if you're a really hardworking person and you do a good job? And the answer is that's almost never possible for anybody who's here undocumented. So I'll give you an example. There's probably a couple of examples that maybe hit for folks down in your neck of the woods. There's a lot of people who work in agriculture and ranching throughout Colorado and the country who don't have status. A lot of them have worked with the same family or the same farm or the same organization for a decade, maybe two, maybe more. They're not getting a green card, period. It doesn't matter how hard working they are. It doesn't matter if they're a good person. It doesn't matter if they have 5 children. It doesn't matter if they pay their taxes. It doesn't matter if they haven't been in trouble. There's no pathway. That's an important point because I think people naturally want to think, and as do I, that like if you're a hardworking person and you keep your nose clean and stay out of trouble, then you're going to be okay. No, you're not. That just doesn't exist in this situation. Because if it did, and if there was a pathway for hardworking people without status who pay taxes and contribute to their communities and have kids and go to church and play on the soccer team, we wouldn't really have many undocumented people in the country because most people are pretty hardworking. Most people are trying to make the world better for their kids. And most people are ecstatic to be part of the community that they're in because that's why they came here in the first place, for a better life. There's just not a pathway for them. So this is a conversation I often have a lot of times. That's a real frustrating conversation when I talk with people who have long-term employees who are undocumented and they discover and want to help them. If someone comes in and says, this guy's functionally running my ranch, I can't hire a citizen to do that. How much money you need, Hans? We want me to wheelbarrow in here $50,000 and get this guy a green card, I'll do it. And I say, sorry, ain't nothing to do. He's a real great guy. There's no pathway. And that's one sort of example of where sort of like on the local level, when it plays out, it becomes a little confusing because that group of people are just kind of stuck and they don't have an ability to use any process. There's no legal process for them to follow to get a green card.
And are they stuck because they came in here without papers? Is that the sense?
Yeah, exactly. So the problem is like, there may be like a good rationale on some policy level to say, well, if you broke the law by coming in, we got to figure out a way to hold you accountable and punish you, and you got to overcome some extra stuff. As it plays out realistically, somebody comes in and has been here for 2 decades, the sort of argument for why we should keep them from being able to get status becomes a little bit harder to justify if they paid taxes for 20 years, right? And they've got a family in the country, and they've never taken a public benefit for one day of their life. So I know I'm describing people that y'all know, who are just hardworking folks, just like salt of the earth people, wake up every day at 5 a.m., go out, do a hard day's work, come home, hang out with their families, right? Rinse and repeat for 2 decades. Unfortunately, the law is very strict in this sense, and there's no pathway to do that through employment in that situation. Where there are pathways is for very, and this is probably unsurprising, for, high-end people, fancy lawyers like me, doctors, tech workers. Those pathways are a lot easier for people to navigate, to go from having a visa to getting a green card. They're still not easy, but they exist, and they're a lot easier to navigate. But unfortunately, in this context, it's not really doable. I'll talk about a couple of other types of status, and this might go to one of the questions or comments, which is some other common stuff. And let's talk maybe about the first one, about DACA. So DACA is a temporary protection against deportation that allows people the opportunity for work authorization. It is not really like it's not a permanent status. Yeah, sorry, I've got a cat on my lap. And so this is a population of people who are kids when they come into the country, and they grow up here, they go to school here, they graduate from high school. Most of these folks are working in the workforce. Most of them have families or kids. They haven't really been in trouble other than maybe something super small. And that program is still in existence. Now, the Trump administration, in the first Trump administration, tried to kill this program or end this program, and it was blocked for technical legal reasons. Interestingly enough, this is probably the one program that Trump hasn't yet tried to put on the chopping block, on Trump 2.0. That's kind of an interesting thing. And there's a couple of reasons, I think, for that, is that a lot of big business and a lot of business interests really want people with DACA status to keep their DACA status. Because a lot of these folks are pretty highly professional or well-trained, or at least have been around forever, right? So they've got jobs, they're integrated into the community, they're paying taxes, and they've grown up here for 20, 30 years. And, to be blunt, like, we as taxpayers and as a community have invested in them. Like, they went through our public education schools, right? They've got degrees from our universities. So there's a good reason to have them around from a policy perspective, in addition to the fact that it's like, we're talking about people who are kids, right? When they came in, they didn't really have a choice. They just came, right? Because they came with parents or extended family members. This program is still in existence. It's unclear what's going to happen with it. But I think by the fact that it hasn't been focused on yet is maybe a positive sign that at least this aspect of immigration law, Trump may actually see the validity or in maintaining it, or at least the risk politically in trying to get rid of it. Temporary protected status is a whole different kettle of fish, right? Temporary protected status has been on the chopping block for the Trump administration since day one. Temporary protected status is this. It's very similar to DACA in that it provides you a temporary protection and work authorization. And it's usually based on a decision made by the president / the Department of Homeland Security that they want to create a temporary protected program for people from a particular country for a particular reason. A lot of times it can be natural disaster. Sometimes it can be war related or condition related. Some examples include El Salvador, Ukraine, Venezuela. There's probably a dozen countries that have been on the TPS list off and on, sometimes only for a year, sometimes for much longer. And the interesting thing about temporary protected status is that, again, like everything else, it doesn't lead to a green card. The other important thing is that you don't get temporary protected status if you haven't already been here when the president announces temporary protected status. So it's not like Biden would say, I'm granting temporary protected status to people from Ukraine, and then a bunch of people from Ukraine fly to the US and get it. It's not how it works. And the reason for that is they don't want to create a draw to pull people into the country to have an incentive to come and then apply for something. So TPS is usually granted because after the fact, the government realizes there's like a major natural disaster or some other issue, and they decide for temporary reasons, we're going to, provide these people a temporary protection, and then usually that protection evaporates. But this has been a flashpoint for the Trump administration to eliminate that for El Salvador, for Venezuela, for Haiti, for Ukraine, for all sorts of different countries. And that's been a kind of ongoing battle in the courts for various reasons. Third category of people are like student visas and tourist visas. And this is people who come to visit and they can maybe stay up to 6 months. They want to travel, they want to go to the Grand Canyon, they want to see America. F1 and J1 students are, usually what we call international students, and they come to the US maybe to learn English, or they pursue a undergrad degree or a postgraduate degree at a state school. And the F1 and J1 students actually, they pay out of state tuition. So like they're a very important revenue source for state universities because they're paying full freight to go to a US university. So it's a big way that schools help balance their budgets, just to be blunt. And then H-1B and high-end visas, and this is kind of the fancy tech visas and specialized visas. Maybe we'll pause there, and then we can do any questions real quick about some of that. And then I can jump into immigration court real quick, and then maybe we'll wrap it up. What are we supposed to go till 11:15 or 11:30?
11:30 or 12 is what we.
Oh, okay, gotcha. All right, we got a little time. I don't want to bore you all to tears, so.
Are the H-1B and high-end visas, is the administration still supportive of that? I know they've been very critical of universities and very critical of students who have maybe exercised First
Free
Amendment
speech.
rights.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But they also feel, part of the reason for allowing immigration to occur is to bring in folks that have skills that you need. But I don't, it's hard to know with this administration what's okay and what's not anymore.
Yeah. No, the administration has been hostile to H-1B visas and other high-end visas. This has been like an ongoing policy discussion, and they've backed off of that a little bit because there's a lot of companies. I mean, I'll give you an example. NVIDIA, right? NVIDIA has been driving the economy for like 3 or 4 years. If NVIDIA can't get high-end talent, those people go to Chinese companies in a heartbeat and build microchips for Chinese companies. Like that is like a major US domestic and foreign policy interest that I think that the Trump administration has realized that its hostility towards people who move from like, student visas into high-end visas are finding the barrier so high. They're like, I'll just go to Europe or I'll go to China. Like I have skills. Someone's going to give me a visa and not put all these barriers in my way. So there's some legitimate critiques about that. The perfect example is you have, you might even get an example of a student from China who comes to the US to study computer science as a master's or PhD level or something like that, or maybe from India. They come in on an F1 visa, they pay $50,000 a year to go to the US institution for 2 to 3 years. That's $150,000 that they're putting into the US economy. They graduate. Most of them want to then work in the US with their advanced degree for a US company. So they'll apply to Google or they'll apply to, another company. And if they get an H-1B visa, then they have valid status and they're working for that company, contributing to that company. With canceling F-1 visas or making H-1B visas so prohibitive, that person who's a student eventually just says, you know what, I'll get my degree, but like it's going to be a lot easier for me to go to Germany and they'll pay me, 20% less than the US or 15% less than the US, but I'll get a visa and I'll have a pathway to a status. So I'm going to go there instead. So this is what we call the brain drain, right? Which is that, high-end talent that usually the US has drawn to help with industry and government work is now sort of really being called into question. And, in other countries, Europe and China they're ecstatic about this issue because they're picking people off left and right, So if you ask any major company working in the tech sector, or if you are high-end stuff or medical field or other things, this is a major issue because it creates a lot of barriers and people are just giving up and they're going other places where they can get better offers. Kathy, I think you had your hand up, Kathy.
Yeah, I'm interested in the DACA program. Is it temporary, a temporary category, or is it temporary for the people that have the classification? And are they still accepting enrollees?
That's a great set of questions. So DACA is not in the law. DACA is an executive policy that was passed, or that was not passed. I shouldn't even use the word passed. That was created by the Obama administration. And so because it's not in the law, it can be taken away, right? One executive gives, the other can take it away. So that's really kind of the distinction about deferred action is there's no actual concrete protection. In terms of applications, anybody who currently has DACA has been able to renew it. And there was a window in which applications for people to apply who now have become eligible existed, and then that process was sort of blocked in the courts for about 5 or 6 years. And now there's some movement that it appears that some of those old applications that were filed and blocked 5 or 6 years ago may start to be decided. But this is really nuanced and complicated, and there's like a bunch of litigation going on in the federal courts. And so we haven't really seen any movement on these new applications being accepted. And at this point, even if they were, the quantity of people who qualify for new applications is going to be close to non-existent because of the way the criteria were set up. And the fact that a lot of people who are eligible either have it or never applied and probably aren't going to get it now.
Yes, I have a question about the migrant workers that come and pick strawberries and work on the ranches. Where do they fit in on all or all these different type of visas?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for the question. There are a couple of categories of visas to allow people to come in for agricultural work and harvesting and those types of things. And they'll allow people to be here for, certain periods of time. Maybe it's 4 months, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 8 months for that process. And some people do apply for and get those visas and come in, work, go back to their home country, come back the next year, work, go back to their home country. So there is a level of visas for that. It can be a bit difficult to navigate. And I think my experience with a lot of employers is that the cost to be able to try to do that and being able to consistently have that happen together with the cycle of like the needs of agriculture or the needs of a farm, which vary depending on the season and other things, can be kind of challenging. Then there's just a significant group of migrant farm workers that just don't have status. They move from place to place and they work in agriculture and they just don't have any status. Maybe they come into the country without permission, or maybe they've just lived here without permission for years.
mentioned several times that people who are here illegally are paying taxes. If they're working, they're paying taxes. And one of the big arguments that people who are not happy with immigrants in this country use is that they're coming in addition to they're taking our jobs, they are also draining us of our money in our public services. So could you address that? Exactly what benefits, if any, does someone without status have, even though they pay tax?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. It gets a little nuanced, but let's talk about it because I do think it is one of probably like the most misunderstood parts of this conversation. So for anybody who is working as an undocumented person, they're having taxes withdrawn from their pay stubs, right? Because they need to file a W-2 to get a job, and then those taxes are withdrawn. So there's going to be Social Security and FICA and Medicaid and all that other stuff withdrawn from their paychecks. Most people who are undocumented and are working are just making up a number. It's not a real number. And the Social Security money that's pulled out of those taxes, that goes into a slush fund that basically supports U.S. citizens who are on Social Security. So you could look it up and you could just ask the government how much unclaimed Social Security revenue is being used to give me Social Security benefits as a 70-year-old or whatever. And it's not insignificant. There's a huge propping up of the Social Security system because every single undocumented person who has a job is paying into it and not collecting. That's one piece of it in terms of Social Security. Now, if that person eventually obtains a green card, they are entitled to their Social Security benefits because that Social Security has nothing to do with status. It has to do with, are you a worker and do you deserve the compensation for the wages that you paid in? And the answer is yes. But if you don't have status, you can't collect it. And that's where it goes into the slush fund and pays for other people's Social Security. So that's the Social Security piece, which I think is like, you could probably Google it in 10 seconds and you'll be able to see how much money is contributed to that slush fund by undocumented folks who can't collect. Then the second thing is just like payroll taxes and everything else, and anybody who's working pays those taxes. Then there's sales taxes. Anybody who's living in the country pays those taxes when they go buy dinner or whatever. So there's payment into the tax space that's pretty significant. In my office and in my practice, I'm always actually a little bit surprised about how badly immigrants want to pay taxes and how badly citizens don't want to pay taxes. So it's kind of interesting. I'm looking for every tax loophole. I'll just tell you that. I'm always looking for every tax loophole. I'll own it all day long. There's various reasons for that. I don't mind funding social services, but I'm not a big fan of funding war. But that's a different conversation. In this conversation, most immigrants come to me and they say, I want to pay taxes because if there's ever an opportunity for me to apply for status, I want to be able to show that I'm contributing to this country. And I say, great. I agree with you. I think that's a great idea. I think you should pay taxes. Most people are more than happy to do that. Again, not everybody, but I would say the percentage for immigrants versus citizens is way more immigrants are interested in paying taxes and way less citizens are interested in paying taxes. It's an interesting thing to note. I will say another thing about that. Historically, the IRS and DHS have had a firewall between information given to the IRS to pay taxes and information that ICE has access to. The reason being the government wants its money, right? And if IRS shared that information with the Department of Homeland Security, lawyers like me would have to tell clients, hey, just so you know, your information is going to get shared with ICE if you do the right thing and pay taxes. So for, 20, 30 years, there was a firewall between that allowed us to say, I think you're okay. This isn't going to put you at risk. And you should pay taxes because it's the right thing to do as a member of our community. That's gone. So the Trump administration has broken that firewall, and now the IRS can and will share information with ICE. So, and the Trump administration has said, well, that's our goal. That's our policy. And so that's where we're at right now. So when people come to me this year, and they ask me, what should I do? I say, well, tax law imposes an obligation on you to pay taxes. And they're like, well, can I pay taxes and not be afraid that doing so is going to put me at risk? And my answer is no. Now you need to make the best decision for you. I can't advise you on what to do. And you can imagine if you were here and you were a person who wanted to pay taxes, but doing so could risk taking you away from your 3 kids, you probably have a harder conversation and decision to make about whether it makes sense to do so. So, that is a really unfortunate change. That is not a change made by immigrant populations. It's a change made by the Trump administration, right? And that will have certain policy implications, and it's still very, very, very early, so we're not sure exactly how it's going to play out. In terms of public benefits, immigrants are not eligible, or non-citizens who don't lack status are not eligible for our things like unemployment insurance and all sorts of other, like, food stamps and other financial assistance. And they're just not eligible. And if they were to lie and get them, they're going to have a heck of a time ever getting status in the future. So that is another thing that I think is important to keep in mind, which is most people don't want to do that. They're very risk adverse, and they don't want to take something that they're not entitled to, especially because most of them have hopes of being able to obtain status in the future. There is a use of some tax money to support immigrants, and that usually comes in the form of like emergency Medicaid, right? Which is if someone who doesn't have status and doesn't have insurance because the employer won't insure them or they can't afford it, gets hit by a bus and they get taken to the hospital in an emergency situation, just like they would for me if I had no insurance. The hospital will treat them and then bill Medicaid, right? So emergency medical services, regardless of whether you're a citizen or an immigrant. I mean, if it's a person experiencing homelessness who doesn't have insurance, who's a citizen, we're going to pay for it as taxpayers. That's just what we do in the emergency situation. Same thing for somebody who's a non-citizen. If there's an emergency and they need medical care, that ultimately is paid for by the taxpayers. But there is like a cost, but the cost is pretty much well outstripped by the contribution as taxpayers. Kathy, I think you had a comment or a question, and there was another one in the chat.
Yeah. I have a question. This might be a little far afield, but as I understand it, the immigration courts are civil courts, and we're detaining people without due process and without a court-appointed attorney.
Yeah.
Is coming over the border or is being undocumented a crime?
This is a great set of questions. And it also moves us into the next part of the presentation, which is great. Let me address the comment or the question in the chat real quick, which is, what's the approximate number of different types of non-immigrant visas? Great question, Suzanne, and you're going to love this answer. I don't know. Because non-immigrant visas are given by the Department of State in countries all around the world, and I don't know what that number is. I know that most people who apply are denied a tourist visa or some sort of visa to come to the US. It becomes very difficult to obtain those, and it's very discretionary. So, that's something to keep in mind is, I would say, in my experience in Latin America, when I lived there and had people going to the consulate to ask for a tourist visa, maybe 10% of them would get approved, maybe less, So it's a pretty difficult process to qualify for a tourist visa. You've really got to show that you have enough connections in your home country that you're going to go back, right? That's what the US is worried about. Do you have a home? Do you have a job? Do you have family? Do you have kids? Or are you going to go back to be with them? So that's usually what they're looking for when they're looking for visas. Work visas and other things are a little more static, like H-1B visas have a certain number, but other visas don't necessarily have certain caps. But Kathy, let's move over to your question, which is immigration court due process coming over the border. So there's a lot there. Let's start with the last question, which is what's a crime and what's not a crime, right? being undocumented is not a crime under federal law, period, right? The act of crossing the border without permission is a misdemeanor. So like entering the country and crossing a border that you're not allowed to cross is a crime. That's a misdemeanor. If you have been deported and you come back and illegally, that's a felony, right? So the punishment does go up for someone who's been deported and then comes back illegally. So there is a crime aspect to that for people who enter illegally. But someone who maybe came into the country without status and then, or sorry, came with a visa and overstayed has not committed any crime at all. And if somebody has come in and then been here forever, they're no longer subject to criminal prosecution because statute of limitations has run. And it would be a misdemeanor even just for the entry. But let's maybe move here quickly to a couple other things in my PowerPoint, which are things around immigration court and enforcement, because that's a big thing that we're seeing right now. So let's move and talk a little bit about the immigration court system really quick. And before we get into immigration court systems, let me talk about what's happening sort of in the current world, which is we're seeing really like the most radical redeployment of federal resources to focus on civil immigration enforcement that we've seen at least in the last 40 to 50 years. I think probably the only thing that rivals it is, to be blunt, the term Operation Wetback, which was the enforcement program in the 40s when the federal government went around and rounded up a bunch of people who they perceived to be non-citizens, mostly folks from Mexico, shortly after the end of World War II, because their labor was no longer as valuable because the men from war were now home. So the enforcement paradigm here is pretty intense, and much of what we're going to see is going to be an immigration enforcement, arrests, detention, and immigration court cases. So I probably can't overemphasize enough just how dark and complicated this is from the perspective of not an immigration advocate, but a person who believes in the rule of law. Because for better or worse, what we're seeing is ICE sort of routinely and consistently and brazenly refusing to follow the law when the law is used against them to hold them accountable. You can hear about judges ordering ICE not to deport someone and they ignore it and deport them, right? Or judges ordering ICE to release somebody from custody or detention because their detention is illegal, and ICE doing everything in its power to not follow the law. So I think what we're seeing right now, for better or worse, is a complete collapse of the legitimacy of ICE as a law enforcement agency. And I say that because local and state cops, for the most part, uphold the Constitution. Like, they swear an oath to do that. And so do most federal officers, FBI, ATF. I'm not a big fan of cops, but the cops who do good jobs are good people, and they've sworn a duty to uphold the Constitution. And that I can live with all day long. The problem is that while not everybody in ICE has sort of abandoned that principle, I think, unfortunately, the culture of saying you can ignore the Constitution and you can ignore constitutional laws and protections for everybody is more the rule than the exception in ICE, whereas it's really the rare exception in other law enforcement agencies. So we're going to continue to see this, and it's going to continue to be a pretty difficult and bleak and complicated picture moving forward. And to be blunt, we're just getting started, right? It's going to continue along this route from my experience. And this is really going to be where we have an inflection point in our country about who needs to follow the rule of law and who doesn't. So let's kind of jump into this a little bit. I just want to talk about immigration court a little bit. So we're going to talk about who would get put into immigration court generally. That would be people who either lack status, like someone who's here undocumented or whose visa expired, or someone who the government says you've done something that allows us to take away your status, particular criminal conviction or some other thing. the vast majority of these people who are in immigration court and detention are people who lived in the country for long periods of time who ICE has just come out and picked up, right? And you probably have had this experience in Cortez, right? Where people in your community have been arrested and taken to immigration detention. And most of these folks are folks who've been around for a decade or more as a general rule. Most of them tend to have very little, if any, criminal history at all. And most of them tend to have families who are pretty well connected and pretty well rooted in the country. And this is what's creating a lot of the tension because, you know, the talking point by the Trump administration is we're going after the worst of the worst, which is always going to be the talking point of any administration, Democrat or Republican, because no one's going to get in front of a camera and say, we want to deport small children and pregnant moms and people who are really good members of their community because we just hate people. This is never going to happen, right? There's always going to be the propaganda campaign that says we're going after the worst of the worst. But when you drill down into the statistics, that's just not true, right? So you'd have to get into the details, but realistically, most of the folks being arrested and detained right now don't have any contact with law enforcement. They've been around for a long time. The reason that that's happening is because the Trump administration and Stephen Miller have set what we call a deportation quota of 3,000 people a day. So they don't care what somebody's history is. They want bodies. That's what they want. They want bodies, and they want to say we deported 1 million people. We don't care if it's a dad who is taking his daughter to school. We don't care. We don't care if it's a woman who's a school teacher in the local high school. We don't care. And I think that's just important to keep in mind because the quota drives the actions, right? If the quota is 3,000 people a day, you're just going to go out and try to get anybody you can. So immigration court, we have, I don't know, just this is super fast. It's like you have courts where you kind of talk about things and ask for bond and see whether or not the government can prove or demonstrate that the person might be deportable. And then you have basically ways to actually try to fight to stay if the government can prove you're deportable. A couple things to keep in mind, which are pretty sobering, is that at least from the perspective of due process, in criminal law, we have what's called a constitutional right to an attorney for anybody who's in custody if they don't have money, right? And it's called Gideon v. Wainwright. It's called the right to appointed counsel. In immigration law, you do have a right to an attorney, but you have no right to an appointed attorney or an attorney if you can't afford one. So as a result, in Colorado at least, 0% of people have to face a criminal charge without an attorney. They have a right to one unless they don't want one. They could choose not to have one, but they have. So there's 0% of people who are forced to go in front of a judge if they're indigent without an attorney. In immigration law, it's about 85% of people in detention go in front of a judge without an attorney. And then there's just a lot more limited rights in immigration law than there are in like criminal law or normal court, even like a civil court. And I'm going to kind of skip through this because it's a little detailed, but it's basically there's a lot less protection. If and when a person is arrested by ICE, there is something important to think about. I think most people colloquially think if ICE arrests me, I'm going to get deported. That is not true if you have a good lawyer. Being detained and put into immigration detention starts the deportation process. But a lot of times the law allows people to either keep their status or get their status even if they're in immigration court. For example, I mean, another example would be like you might get charged in a criminal context, you might get charged with assaulting somebody, but you might say, hey, I acted in self-defense because they were trying to attack my girlfriend or my sister or my brother, and so I defended them. And that would be a defense. It would be a way to say, I'm not guilty, right? And in immigration court, there's other statutory defenses to deportation to say, well, I do have a pathway to status, or what you're arguing makes me deportable isn't actually deportable. So it's a little complicated, but it's all to say just because a person is picked up by ICE doesn't mean it's the end of the story. it gets very complicated, but a lot of times there's many opportunities for people to try to fight to stay. The first thing that people usually are trying to do is get a bond, right? And that's because there's two immigration courts. There's an immigration court for people who are out of custody, and that process, those cases can take 1 to 5 years. It just depends on the case and the busyness of the court and the process. In detention, those cases usually take a 1 week to 1 year at max. So they're a lot faster. And a lot of times it makes it very hard for us to prepare a good case to demonstrate why a judge should allow a person to stay, because they're detained and things move so fast. There's also a provision in immigration law called mandatory detention. And mandatory detention was a law that was passed in 1997 that was largely drafted and supported by corporate private prison companies that allows the government to put people who are immigrants into detention without being eligible for bond, usually for very, very small little quality of life things like a shoplifting conviction, right? And so that keeps large populations of immigrants in detention, which is very, very good for a couple of corporations, one of them being the Geo Group, because they make about $150 a day from taxpayers to hold a person in detention. And so it's a very good money-making model for these corporations that usually do immigration detention work, because they're very broad and they do sweep in a lot of people, for better or for worse. Let me talk through a couple of ways that people can avoid being deported if they're in immigration court, and then I'll back out of this and we can talk a little bit more. The first one and the most common one is what we call adjustment of status, or applying for your green card. So let's just say, for example, I got married to a US citizen. I'm that Hans who came in on a visa, and I got married to a US citizen, but we just never bothered to file, or maybe we didn't have the money, right? Or maybe, my parents had some medical issues and I needed to spend the money on them first, and we were going to come back and apply later. You can still apply for that stuff even in immigration court. Sometimes too, you can qualify for certain visas and certain protections. So temporary protected status, sometimes you can get that in immigration court. Or sometimes you have an application pending and you can use that to stop your deportation. Again, it's hard, but there are opportunities to do that. Sometimes when people are picked up, they then apply for asylum or other what we call persecution-based relief from removal, or defenses based on being afraid that you'll be persecuted, hurt, or killed if you're deported. And then in Section D, we have what's called VAWA, U visas, and T visas. And these are temporary or permanent protections for certain people who have been victims of very serious crimes. And then we have basically what we call cancellation of removal. And cancellation of removal is mostly for undocumented people who have lived in the country more than 10 years, who have citizen family members, spouses, parents, or kids, who don't have criminal history that disqualifies them and can demonstrate they're good people. And who really, to win, you have to demonstrate that your family would have what we would call exceptional and extremely unusual hardship if you were deported. And so that is a defense that some undocumented people have. It's a hard one, but it is one that some people who've been here a long time can present and say basically to the judge, there's no pathway for me to get a green card, or else I would have done it. But I'm a good person. I've been here for 2 decades. I've got 3 kids. One of them has autism. You deport me, then the state of Colorado and the feds are going to pay for everything, right, for this person, whereas I can provide for them because I have a job and I have health insurance, and they need a dad or a mom there to take them to appointments and make sure that they're taken care of, so that they can actually live a productive life. And so that's an example of maybe a type of case, or maybe somebody has a wife who has cancer, by a US citizen wife, and the spouse is taking care of them and making sure that they're getting to their chemotherapy and handling the bills and handling all of the issues and trying to make sure that they can still go to their medical appointments and work on trying to beat their disease. And that's an example of another person who might be able to win that type of case by showing a judge that they deserve to stay. So those are kind of the defenses in immigration court, and a brief discussion of how the immigration court process works. Any questions, comments about that?
have a question. I attended a bond hearing for our local community member that's in detention right now, and the federal or I guess federal attorney couldn't get a sentence out that made any sense. And the judge decided to let them write a brief and submit a brief. But I had this moment of hope where the judge was just going to acknowledge that they couldn't really represent the federal government well. What are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for asking it. So this is an area of specialization in our office and probably a big focus of our work. So I'll start off and say, historically, it's kind of important to remember here the structure of things. Immigration judges are not independent judges. They actually work for the Department of Justice, which means they work for the Trump administration, right? Or any administration, regardless of Obama, right? Bush, whatever. So they're not impartial in that way. So they're susceptible to pressure. Number two, the Trump administration has fired 128 immigration judges because they perceive them to be interpreting the law too favorably. They've basically completely eradicated anybody they don't like. And they've instilled people who have a very hostile view towards the law as it relates to immigration. So immigration courts, to be blunt, are not fair. They're just not. And they're not fair for a couple reasons. Number one, some of those judges who have come in are really, really radically hardline and have very unsupportable legal interpretations, but are towing the Trump agenda, right? Then there's another population of judges who are going to fall in line because they don't want to lose their job. So they don't want to lose their salary making $200,000 a year by giving your community member a bond, which means that their supervisor tells somebody in DOJ and the next day they get fired. That happens. That has happened in Denver. That has happened in every immigration court around the country. So that's the backdrop on immigration court, which makes it very, very challenging. And on top of that, ICE and the immigration lawyers representing ICE have been told to argue at all costs that every person, regardless of anything, must be detained and doesn't merit release on bond to a level that's really quite ridiculous, right? So that's kind of the world we're in right now because ICE is smart. They know if they can grab you and they can put you in a cage, the statistical chances of you being able to get out of that cage go down radically because the system is built and designed not to get you out. And so it just means you don't have a chance to fight what is otherwise a valid case. We have lots of valid cases and people give them up. I can guarantee you, I can't see all of you in the room, but if I could put every single one of you in a cage for 6 months and you were innocent of something or could do something, you'd probably give it up too. Because you'd lose your job, you'd lose your home, you'd lose your family, you'd lose your will to live, and you would probably fall into a clinical depression because you would be in a cage. And you'd be paying me on top of that to try to get you out. So that's basically just how that process works, for better or worse. It's very effective. And that's what the Trump administration is banking on, being able to use that. Now, I don't want to be completely negative because there are places we can win. We are able to get people out of detention. There are some judges who still try to do the right thing. But it is a hard landscape. And having done this work for 2 decades, it is by far the darkest I've ever seen. And so it's a very, very difficult moment in trying to defend people's due process and constitutional rights in a court that answers to Trump.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also, I hope that your community member gets out and gets home.
I hope so too. It's been since October 8th.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say, you have not bored me to tears. You have depressed me to tears. And I just hope somehow or other this country will get a wake-up moment and realize the injustices that are being propagated in this country.
Yeah. Thank you for making that comment. And maybe this is the opportunity for the last 10 minutes to pivot into some stuff that's positive. Because I do want to end on like a positive note. And let me try to do that. Let me see. Carol asked a question: how difficult is it for lawyers to see clients at the Aurora Immigration Jail? Yeah, so this is a great question, Carol, and you're definitely honing in on the subtleties. It is incredibly difficult for me to see clients at the Immigration Detention Center. ICE will try to move people to other states. They'll give no notice. Nobody will know anything. They make it very hard to try to have access. They restrict times when there's count and you can't have access to people. It becomes a very challenging type of law to do. So there's a lot of challenges. Now, we are also having a lot of successes there because we figured out ways to fight back and to go into federal court and argue that immigration courts have sort of abandoned neutrality, and so we need federal courts to step in and build due process back into the game. And we're winning those. The problem is it costs money to do that, right? And a lot of people don't have money, and I'm not a free lawyer, and that's a really ugly reality, right? Is that people are oftentimes getting priced out of justice because, I was a free lawyer for 7 or 8 years, and I probably represented 5,000 people for free. But now I'm in private practice, but the people who are able to provide free legal work are much smaller than the demand for the free legal work, right? And so that becomes really challenging for folks. There are ways to win, and there are ways to help people, especially when communities come together, right? And support people and build campaigns and try to get people back home with their families. But it's a hard road. Let me point to sort of speaking about how we do things to help, protect communities and make sure that we uphold the rule of law. Let me go to one last set of slides real quick. And I wanted to stop on something that I actually think is pretty positive. And these are laws that myself and some groups of people worked on for the last 15 years that now are on the books. And they're important to just keep in mind because I do think they're like helpful for due process. The first one is to sort of like encapsulate it very easily as local and state police cannot enforce immigration law, period. They just can't. They're not allowed to. It's not a question of whether they want to or should or shouldn't. We pass laws to make sure that they cannot. And there's reasons for that. Primary reason is that we need everybody in local communities to trust local cops, because if you can't, then you won't report crimes or you won't be a witness to crime and try to help keep communities safe. And also, it's asking local and state officers to enforce an area of law they know nothing about and are not getting paid to do. So, that's what we call an unfunded mandate, right? Which is like the feds trying to heap on us civil immigration enforcement that we're not trained for and that we're not being compensated to do. So as a result, jails can't hold people for longer than they're allowed to until they post their bond. Local officers can't arrest people for civil immigration violations. Probation officers can't share information with ICE. Those are important ways just to kind of limit that and build trust back into local law enforcement. So, people can talk to the local sheriff. People can talk to the local police department and, get help or protection without having that fear. We also pass laws to try to keep ICE from arresting people in and around courts because people need to go to court to report crimes or get a divorce or, get custody for their kids or pay a traffic ticket. So we have that law in place, although ICE is trying to get around that to arrest people. So that's something that we're currently battling. One other state thing is providing driver's licenses to people regardless of status, just because we'd rather have people who know how to drive and are regulated and insured on the roads of Colorado than people who aren't. And that allows people to kind of move around, drive, get to work, and comply with state and local laws that help ensure that everybody's safe and everybody's insured and registered. So there's a couple examples of some of those laws on the books. I think the other thing that I would end with is just to say, like, those laws, I think, distinguish Colorado from a lot of other places, primarily the one around local and state law enforcement. One of the other reasons that we passed that law is twofold, right? One, that's our response to keep people to keep bad cops from racially profiling people. right? That's an important goal. And number two, it also makes sure that good cops know that communities can trust them, right? Because they know that communities know that when they call, when they have law enforcement involved, law enforcement is supposed to be focused on what's happening in my local community. How can I keep you safe? How can I make sure that someone who broke the law is held appropriately accountable? And how can I make sure a victim receives services and support? And so the nice part about these laws is the majority of law enforcement have supported us in passing those laws because they get it at the end of the day. You know, if a community can't trust someone, they're not going to call, you know, regardless of whether it's something that happened to them or it's something that happened to somebody else that they saw. I think the last thing I would say is that local community work, building local community power to support community members, like maybe like the comment we had about a community member in detention, is a really important way for local communities to show up for people, right? Because you have that relationship with that person. You know that person is a human being. And so being able to support them in navigating and trying to get out of detention, reintegrate into communities, and to actually work on applying for status or a defense in immigration court is really important. And a lot of people, if they can get out and they can find an attorney, they do have something that they can use as a pathway, or at least something that is worth trying for. So I think like the way that I view this is, at the end of the day, I think the work of local communities and supporting their non-citizen members, immigrants with or without status, is just as important as anything coming out of the federal government. That's the way that locally and at a state level, we try to make sure that we honor communities and kind of make sure we guard due process and fairness to the extent that we can in a time of great difficulty.
Let me ask one quick question. We obviously know that our immigration system is broken. Are there countries that have good immigration systems? And if there are, what are the, without going into great detail, what are the hallmarks of those systems that make them good immigration systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's kind of complicated. And I don't know a ton about other countries' specifics, but a lot of them have been more successful in updating their laws to reflect the sort of actual conditions of like their country in the moment that we're talking about. So for example, some countries are better about saying, okay, well, how do we create a system for people to apply for permanent status through employment if they're contributing? Because it's a waste of our time to spend all that energy and money taking people out of the country who are actually being productive. And we just haven't had that legislation for 40 years, right? So like it's outdated. So I think there's other countries that have been better about doing that, to build in a balance to say, okay, well, you know, we need to enforce borders, but also we need to be smart about not just the economic needs of the country, but the humanity of the people who live there. And I think they're just better at doing that and passing legislation that is timely and updates things. I mean, do any of us still drive a car from 40 years ago? Probably not. I mean, I have a car that's 40 years old, but probably very few other people do. And you certainly don't have a laptop, right? Or a computer that's 40 years old because it doesn't work anymore, right? It's the same thing with law. Like we've got to update it so that it can reflect current dynamics and give people opportunities while also, you know, balancing the legitimate interests about national sovereignty and safety and security. So I think that be an example. That's a broad based about like places like Canada and other places that have been able to update their laws that are a little more reflective of the reality that they're dealing
Yes, Kathy?
Yeah, sorry I asked so many questions. I could talk to you for a couple hours. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing in the community. I know you've made a big impact. I have a question about, we see that the president wants to buy all these warehouses to detain people. And yet the immigration courts seem to be backlogged almost to the point of gridlock.
with.
Do you think that this is an indication that they're just not going, you've already talked about that they're violating the rule of law. Or is there some, do you think they're going to keep all these people detained until they go through the immigration courts?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and you're right. There's a lot of conversation and movement towards building these warehouses, right? Of holding people. And again, like it's worth pausing and saying, we're talking about building warehouses to put people in cages. It's like that's worth 5 seconds of just like thinking about, right? Historically, that's pretty dark, whether that's the US or other countries. Also, there are plans to open at least one other detention center in Colorado. That would be the Hudson facility north of Denver in Adams County. And then the other facility down near Walsenburg is also a facility that they're thinking about opening up, which would triple the detention capacity in Colorado. So that's pretty significant. To your question, Kathy, I think the strategy is if you can detain people and you can deprive them of liberty, you in many ways strip them of their humanity and their ability to sort of avail themselves of the law. There's a lot of people, like I did the hypo with, if I put any one of you in jail and took you away from your families and took away everything you had, most of you would give up. I know this just because I've represented poor people for a long time, right? And poor people plead guilty to crimes they did not commit to get out of jail. That's it, right? That's the way that it works. And then some of them did it, but it's like shoplifting or something dumb, right? But like the damage it causes by detaining people is significant. So the strategy is if you can detain people, even where the law allows them a pathway, and even assuming the judge isn't totally in Donald Trump's pocket, and even assuming you can hire an attorney to fight that case, the uphill battle to win that case under those scenarios is so high that 9 out of 10 people will give up a good case because they can't do it from detention. Now, if they were able to pay a bond and get out and go back into the community and support their children and be at home, we would be able to build a case and we would be better able to take it to a judge and justify why they should be able to stay, right? Like we would win under the law. And so the strategy is that even because we can win under the law, they want to create the conditions as so difficult that most people will give up something that's otherwise legitimate. So I think that's the strategy, right? If I was advising Donald Trump, that would be my strategy. And so the response is, how do we prevent that from happening, right? Step one for us in Colorado is to try to keep these prisons from being opened, right? Or to make them as difficult to reopen as humanly possible. Because if, it's just like Field of Dreams, right? Like if you build it, they will come. Meaning, if they open those spots, they're going to fill it with bodies. And that means they're going to go out and pick up moms and dads and kids and students and everybody else. Like there's no distinction here. When you triple the detention capacity, they're coming for everybody they can. And that's not alarmist. That's just the strategy, right? Like it's what I would tell people to do, right? I'm just putting on my Stephen Miller hat. And so I think it's incumbent on state and local legislators and local communities to try to resist those moves, to try to keep them from being funded, to try to prevent them from opening. Because I'd much rather never have another detention center open than get 500 new clients in detention. I don't want the blood money of people in cages. I would really prefer to keep people out of cages because it would mean that the government has to be a little more discerning about who it actually tries to target, right? Because they would have a little bit of limitations on their ability to house people in detention.
Yeah. And I mean, and it also infects the entire community because then the community becomes dependent upon the income and the taxes and your services start depending on imprisoning people for no reason.
Yeah, it starts us down a road where we create an economy around incarceration, right?
Right.
And that becomes, that's a conversation we've had for like 5 decades in this country around criminal and civil detention. And So I think it's a big issue, but I think maybe the place to end is that there's still a lot of power that local and state communities have, right? In addition to us voting and midterms and advancing candidates and changing some of this tenor, it's local stuff. It's the local organizing. Like I will end on the highlight, like Colorado has some of the best laws in place to respect the constitutional and civil rights of immigrants of any state in the country. And I'm very proud of that. Like me and other people were involved in that work for about 15 years. And so I think the positive end is like we do live in a state that really does respect people's rights for the most part. And our local and state elected officials are mostly in line with that. And that's where we need to keep up the pressure. And that's why Donald Trump is going to target us at some point, because like a couple of other places, we have presented a model of respecting civil rights and civil liberties for immigrant community members, standing up for constitutional rights, and saying that we don't want to allow those types of abuses in our community. So, you know, that will be incumbent on local communities to sort of stand our ground.
Well, thank you very much. This is a very interesting program.
Thank you. Everybody, can I take one more question? And other than that, I might need to step out here in a second. I've talked your ear off for 1 hour and 50 minutes.
Does anybody have one last question here?
Well, what would you want us to take away to our immigrant community? What's the best message that we could give them right now?
Great question to end on. I think just the solidarity and support. So I think for folks who aren't immigrants, like joining or being affiliated with a local immigrant rights organization, that might be Compañeros or another organization in the Cortez or Southwest Colorado area. Maybe signing up for the Colorado Rapid Response Network to basically document and try to hold accountable any ICE activity in your community. And just to make sure you're there for people. And that you're supporting candidates, of course, who are going to advance policies that make people's lives better. Yeah, that kind of goes without saying. But I think, you know, being able to tie in locally can be very, very, very powerful. I mean, I think as complicated and disheartening as Minneapolis was, it's also a model of how local communities came together. That's
Thank you.
kind of inspiring. So, you know, I think we've got that here. So, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for letting me talk to you all, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And I think I sent the presentation, if I'm not mistaken, to you, Karen, and feel free to share it with anybody. And you know, if anybody has any questions, they can definitely send me an email.
Thank you.
We have recorded this, and so we'll send that link as well. Thank you, Hans.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks. You guys wait for just a minute.